The Zephyrian Academy for Interstellar Relations had been the galaxy's premier diplomatic training institution for exactly 1,247 standard years, a fact that Professor Kexthal reminded his students of approximately every 17 minutes. Located on the neutral moon of Calidres Prime, the Academy attracted the finest minds from across 47 star systems, all eager to master the delicate art of not starting intergalactic wars over minor cultural misunderstandings. The building itself was a testament to architectural compromise, featuring gravity wells for the Nexari, methane chambers for the Athani, and extremely sturdy furniture for species that occasionally burst into flames when excited. Professor Kexthal possessed 12 tentacles, 4 eyes, and an ego roughly the size of a small gas giant. His species, the Mort Hani, had been mediating disputes since before most civilizations had discovered fire, a point he made with the subtle grace of a neutron star collision. The classroom followed traditional academic design, rows of seats facing forward toward the professor's elevated platform, because apparently the concept of a lecture hall was one of those rare universal constants that transcended species barriers. On any given day, the student body represented a fascinating cross-section of galactic evolution. The crystalline Vorthans sat in the front row, their translucent forms refracting light in patterns that supposedly indicated deep thought, but mostly looked like expensive mood lighting. Behind them, the proud Nexari warrior diplomats maintained perfect posture, while simultaneously calculating exactly how many ways they could kill everyone in the room if negotiations went poorly. The gaseous pip entities floated in specialized containment suits, occasionally releasing puffs of what might have been concentration or possibly just atmospheric pressure adjustments. The Athani delegation clustered near the environmental controls, their scaled forms shifting colors with their emotional states like living mood rings with advanced degrees in political science. Scattered throughout were representatives from dozens of other civilizations, each convinced their species had invented the concept of reasonable discourse, while everyone else was still throwing rocks at things they disagreed with. This carefully orchestrated symphony of interspecies education was humming along quite nicely until the morning Kira Valdez walked through the door. She arrived precisely 11 minutes late on a Tuesday, which was either a display of human temporal dysfunction or a calculated diplomatic statement. Professor Kexthal's primary eyes narrowed as she entered, taking in her unremarkable bipedal form, the frankly primitive single-layer skin, and what appeared to be actual hair growing from her head like some sort of decorative parasite. Humans had only been granted academy admission 3 cycles ago, and frankly, the decision remained controversial in faculty meetings. The professor's voice carried the particular tone reserved for addressing species that had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, and still thought democracy was a good idea. Miss Valdez, I presume? How delightful that you could join us. Please, take a seat in the back corner. We wouldn't want to overwhelm you with too much information at once. The back corner seat was an institution at the Academy, traditionally reserved for species considered to be on academic probation or those whose presence was more political necessity than educational merit. It offered an excellent view of the back of everyone else's heads and served as a constant reminder of one's place in the galactic intellectual hierarchy. Kira nodded once, seemingly unbothered by the assignment, and made her way to the designated seat with a kind of fluid economy of movement that several students noted but none commented on. She settled into the chair, pulled out what appeared to be a primitive data recording device, and waited. Professor Kexthal launched into his standard lecture on the proximate trade disputes of 2387, a conflict that had nearly resulted in 3-way war over the proper pronunciation of hello in 17 different languages. It was a classic case study in how minor cultural misunderstandings could cascade into galaxy-spanning catastrophes, and the professor delivered it with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had given the same lecture 1,247 times. The Vorthans in the front row crystallized their understanding with harmonic resonance patterns. The Nexari took detailed tactical notes. The pip entities bubbled thoughtfully. And in the back corner, the humans sat quietly, those oddly mobile eyes tracking every gesture, every inflection, every subtle interaction between the professor and his clearly favored students. For the first week, this arrangement worked exactly as intended. The human remained silent, presumably struggling to comprehend concepts that came naturally to more evolved species. She took notes on her primitive device, asked no questions, and generally fulfilled everyone's expectations of appropriate background presence. The other students occasionally glanced back with expressions that might have been pity if their species were capable of such emotions, or possibly just checking to see if she was still conscious. Professor Kexthal found this deeply satisfying. Humans, in his considerable experience, were best suited for manual labor and simple pattern recognition tasks. Their inclusion in the academy was obviously some sort of political gesture toward species diversity, and he was perfectly content to let them observe quietly while their intellectual superiors engaged in actual learning. This comfortable dynamic lasted exactly 9 days. On the 10th day, while discussing the delicate negotiations that had prevented the Antarian Mining Consortium from accidentally strip mining a planet with sentient geology, Kira raised a hand. Professor Kexthal blinked his primary eyes in genuine surprise. Yes, Miss Valdez? Do you have a question about the basic concepts we've covered? Actually, Kira said, her voice carrying an oddly casual tone, I was wondering about the water rights clause in the final settlement. Specifically, how the Antarians managed to secure subsurface extraction permits when the planetary consciousness explicitly excluded mineral rights from the negotiation framework. The classroom fell into the kind of silence usually reserved for supernovas and diplomatic incidents. Professor Kexthal's tentacles twitched in what might have been confusion or possibly the early stages of an academic aneurysm. That is, the water rights were a secondary consideration. Right. But the Vegan Codex of 2381 established that any extraction from a sentient planetary body requires direct consent from the consciousness itself, not just surface government representatives. The Antarians got around this by classifying their operation as atmospheric moisture reclamation, which technically didn't require geological consent. Pretty clever, actually. A Vorthan in the front row shifted slightly, their crystalline structure relining to better capture the conversation. It was a movement so subtle that most species wouldn't have noticed it, but Kira's eyes tracked it with the precision of a targeting system. Professor Kexthal cleared his throat, a sound like grinding tectonic plates. Yes, well, that's a rather specific interpretation. Is it wrong? No, it's accurate. Surprisingly so. And there it was, the first crack in the established order. The word surprisingly hung in the air, like an unexploded diplomatic incident. Because surprise implied expectations, and expectations implied assumptions, and assumptions, as any good diplomat knew, were the foundation upon which most galactic conflicts were built. The next day, Kira asked about trade route negotiations with the Centauri Commerce Guild. The day after that, she questioned the legal precedents underlying the Treaty of Vega Minor. By the end of the second week, her questions had evolved into observations that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. The thing about the Nexary honor debt system, she mentioned during a discussion of interspecies commercial law, is that it creates a fascinating loophole in standard contract enforcement. If you structure the agreement as a series of honor obligations rather than legal requirements, you can bypass about 60% of Galactic Trade Commission oversight. Fex Corvani, the Nexary warrior diplomat, turned slightly in her seat. Just slightly. Barely noticeable unless you were watching for exactly that kind of movement. Which Kira was. The human raises an interesting point, Fex admitted, the words seeming to cause her physical pain. Such an interpretation had not occurred to this one. Professor Kexthal's lecture stumbled like a malfunctioning translation matrix. He had been explaining standard commercial law for the better part of 2 centuries, and somehow this barely evolved primate was pointing out nuances that he had never considered. It was deeply offensive to his worldview and also, annoyingly, completely correct. By the 3rd week, the dynamic had shifted in ways that defied academic tradition. Students who had spent their entire educational careers facing forward were now angling their seats at subtle degrees, creating sightlines toward the back corner. It started with the Vorthan who had first turned to listen, then spread to others as Kira's observations became increasingly impossible to ignore. She had a talent for finding the gaps in established thinking, the spaces between what different species considered obvious truths. While the Nexary viewed everything through the lens of honor and conflict, and the Vorthans approached problems with crystalline logical structures, and the PIP entities thought in probability clouds, Kira seemed to synthesize all of these perspectives into something entirely new. The Ithani territorial expansion of 2395, she commented during a lesson on resource conflict resolution, wasn't really about the mining rights at all. They were positioning themselves to control shipping lanes for the inevitable Centauri grain shortage that everyone knew was coming, but no one wanted to acknowledge officially. The Ithani representative, Modak, shifted from neutral green to a color that indicated deep thought mixed with mild offense. This one's people do not engage in such preemptive maneuvering. Of course not, Kira agreed with what might have been completely innocent sincerity. But hypothetically, if someone were to engage in such maneuvering, the Ithani approach would be brilliant. You positioned yourselves to provide humanitarian aid while maintaining plausible deniability about your strategic advantages. It's a kind of long-term thinking that most species can't manage because they are too focused on immediate gains. Mordak's coloration shifted through several phases before settling on what his species considered the visual equivalent of grudging respect. More importantly, he had turned completely around in his seat to face the back of the classroom. Professor Kexthal was beginning to realize that he had a problem. The human was not, as he had assumed, struggling to comprehend advanced diplomatic concepts. She was dissecting them with the casual precision of someone performing routine maintenance on familiar equipment. Weiss, she was doing it in ways that made his other students question their own understanding of material he had been teaching for decades. "Miss Valdez," he said after class one day, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone whose worldview was undergoing unauthorized renovations, "your insights are unexpected. Might I ask where you acquired such detailed knowledge of galactic diplomatic history?" Kira packed her primitive data device with movements that somehow managed to convey both respect and mild amusement. "I read the assigned materials, Professor, and some of the background references, and most of the primary source documents from the Galactic archives, plus the classified addendums that were accidentally left unredacted in the public database. The classified addendums are not supposed to be accessible to student accounts. They are not. But whoever designed your security protocols apparently never encountered someone who grew up with human information networks. Your classification system is really more of a polite suggestion." Professor Kexthal felt something that might have been the early stages of an academic crisis. "You've been accessing classified diplomatic records. Only the ones relevant to class discussions. I'm not interested in state secrets, just context. It's hard to understand why certain decisions were made without knowing what the decision-makers actually knew at the time." This was problematic on several levels, not least because Professor Kexthal himself had never bothered to access those classified addendums. He had been teaching the official version of events for so long that it had never occurred to him to question whether the official version was complete. The fourth week brought the practical exercise that would forever alter the social dynamics of Advanced Galactic Diplomacy 101. Professor Kexthal presented the class with a simulation of current events, a brewing conflict between the Andromedan Trade Federation and the Outer Rim Mining Collective over exploitation rights in the neutral zone. It was a complex scenario involving resource allocation, territorial sovereignty, historical grievances, and the kind of face-saving measures that kept diplomats employed. The professor divided the class into three groups: Federation representatives, mining collective advocates, and neutral mediators. The Federation group, led by the crystalline Vorthans, developed a logical framework based on established precedent and legal code. The mining collective team, dominated by Nexary thinking, crafted a position emphasizing honor, historical claims, and strength-based negotiation. The neutral mediators, a mixed group of various species, attempted to find compromise positions that acknowledged both sides' concerns. After 2 hours of simulation, all three groups had reached an impasse that would likely result in economic sanctions, trade wars, and possibly actual warfare involving ships with very large weapons. "Interesting approaches," Professor Kexthal commented, his tentacles writhing in what might have been academic satisfaction or possibly digestive distress. "However, I noticed that none of your solutions adequately address the underlying structural issues that created this conflict. Miss Valdez, you've been unusually quiet. Any observations?" Kira had indeed been quiet, sitting in her back corner seat while 47 of the galaxy's finest diplomatic minds had spent 2 hours constructing elaborate justifications for why their respective positions were the only reasonable ones. Now she stood up, and somehow that simple movement commanded the attention of the entire room. "The thing is," she said, her voice carrying that same casual tone that had been making Professor Kexthal's tentacles twitch for weeks. Everyone's operating under the assumption that this is actually about mining rights and territorial claims. But if you look at the timing, the real issue is the Andromedan Federation's upcoming leadership transition and the mining collective's debt restructuring with the Centauri Commerce Guild. She walked to the front of the classroom, and every student's head tracked her movement like a planetary defense system following an incoming missile. The Federation needs a victory to demonstrate stability during their leadership change. The mining collective needs to show strength to maintain favorable credit terms with the guild. Neither side actually wants the mining rights. The neutral zone deposits are mostly low-grade or that wouldn't be profitable at current extraction costs. Professor Kexthal found himself turning to follow her movement, an action that went against every instinct of proper classroom hierarchy. Then what do you propose? Give them both what they actually need instead of what they are asking for. The Federation gets a public diplomatic victory by forcing the mining collective to accept environmental restrictions that the collective was planning to implement anyway for cost reasons. The mining collective gets to demonstrate their strength by extracting concessions from the Federation that the Federation wanted to offer anyway to improve their environmental reputation. The classroom had gone completely silent. 47 advanced students from 47 different star systems were staring at the human who had just solved in 5 minutes what they had been unable to resolve in 2 hours. Meanwhile, Kira continued, the actual mining rights get transferred to a joint development consortium managed by neutral parties, which satisfies the territorial sovereignty issues while creating a framework for future cooperation. Everyone saves face, everyone gets what they actually need, and the neutral zone becomes a model for resource-sharing agreements instead of a potential war zone. Thex Corvani, the proud Nexari warrior, was now sitting completely sideways in her seat. This one must inquire, how does the human know of debt restructuring and leadership transitions? Such information is not contained in the scenario briefing. Because the scenario is based on the actual situation developing in Sector 7. Professor Kexthal pulled it from current intelligence reports, probably thinking it would be more engaging than another historical case study. But current events means current context, and current context means all the background factors that don't make it into diplomatic briefings. Every eye, sensor, and consciousness detection apparatus in the room turned toward Professor Kexthal, who was experiencing what his species called cognitive dissonance, and what humans would recognize as having his bluff called by someone who had done her homework better than he had. The human's analysis is. He paused, his tentacles performing complex calculations, entirely correct. The scenario is indeed based on classified intelligence reports regarding Sector 7. And that was the moment when the traditional structure of advanced galactic diplomacy 101 collapsed like a neutron star reaching critical mass. Zarin, the Vorthan who had been the first to turn slightly, now rotated their entire crystalline structure to face the back corner. This one requests permission to relocate seating for optimal learning configuration. Granted, Professor Kexthal said weakly. Thex Corvani stood up and moved her chair to face the back corner directly. This one also requires repositioning for enhanced educational intake. Within minutes, the entire classroom had undergone a geometric transformation that would have impressed a quantum physicist. 47 students had repositioned themselves to face what had once been the worst seat in the room, and Professor Kexthal found himself speaking to a sea of backs while the human in the corner had become the unwitting center of attention. Kira surveyed her new situation with what might have been amusement. This is awkward. Should I move to the front? No, said Pip, the gaseous entity, in a voice like escaping steam. This one believes the human should remain exactly where she is. The perspective from the back corner offers illuminating viewing angles. Professor Kexthal realized that he was facing a pedagogical crisis of unprecedented proportions. His most advanced students were now literally turning their backs on him to focus on the human he had relegated to the corner as an afterthought. 47 civilizations worth of diplomatic training was being turned upside down by someone whose species had only discovered fire a few thousand years ago. Perhaps, he said in a voice that suggested someone was slowly deflating his ego with a precision instrument, we should restructure our classroom arrangements. 6 weeks later, Advanced Galactic Diplomacy 101 had undergone what the Academy's administration euphemistically called pedagogical evolution. The classroom had been completely rearranged with Kira's seat at the center, surrounded by concentric semicircles of other students. Professor Keksthal still technically taught the class, but increasingly found himself facilitating discussions between Kira and whoever had raised the current question. The human had not requested this arrangement. She had not demanded recognition or challenged the existing hierarchy. She had simply sat in her assigned seat and answered questions with a kind of casual competence that made everyone else's elaborate theoretical frameworks look like intellectual architecture designed by committee. Students from other classes began dropping by to observe these discussions. Faculty members started attending as guest lecturers, but mostly listened to Kira dissect diplomatic scenarios with the precision of someone who had grown up in a species that considered conflict resolution a survival skill rather than an academic discipline. The Zephyrian Academy for Interstellar Relations had spent 1,247 standard years training the galaxy's finest diplomatic minds using time-tested methods based on centuries of accumulated wisdom. It had taken exactly 43 days for one human to accidentally demonstrate that most of that accumulated wisdom was really accumulated assumptions. Professor Keksthal found this deeply disturbing and also, in a way that made his tentacles itch with cognitive dissonance, oddly educational. On the final day of term, as students prepared for their comprehensive examinations, Kira raised her hand one last time. "Professor, I have a question about seating arrangements." The entire room turned to look at her with the coordinated precision of a military formation. Professor Keksthal felt a familiar twitch in his tentacles. "Yes, Miss Valdez. Do you think it's ironic that I ended up learning more from the back corner than I would have from the front row?" Professor Keksthal considered this question with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for preventing intergalactic incidents. Around the room, 47 of the galaxy's finest diplomatic minds waited for his response. "Miss Valdez," he said finally, "I believe that might be the most diplomatically dangerous question anyone has asked in this classroom all semester." Kira smiled, which was a peculiarly human expression that somehow managed to convey satisfaction, amusement, and just a hint of the kind of dangerous intelligence that had spent 43 days quietly reorganizing an entire academic discipline. "Thank you, Professor. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear." And in the back corner that had become the center of everything, the human who had never asked to move sat quietly, surrounded by the entire galactic community that had learned, quite accidentally, to face in her direction just in case she decided to say something important. Which, as it turned out, was pretty much every time she opened her mouth.